Well, welcome to another edition of the Hank Unplugged podcast. Our mission is to bring the most inspirational, informative, interesting people on the planet directly to you. And I think that anybody who's listened to the Hank Unplugged podcast will agree that we have made good on that promise. I want to mention at the outset that we upload new videos to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube every week, including every episode of Hank Unplugged, so make sure to subscribe to the Bible Answer Man YouTube channel. Also, do remember that this ministry produces an award-winning magazine, the Christian Research Journal. You can subscribe to the journal online at equip.org. You can also write me at Box 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina, zip code 28271. Well, on today's Hank Unplugged, I have a very special guest. He's a friend of the ministry. He has been someone that God has placed in my life at exactly the right time. His name is Nathan Jacobs. He's a PhD, a visiting scholar of philosophy at the University of Kentucky. He holds advanced degrees in philosophy, historical and systematic theology, church history, and fine art. He has served as a professor and lecturer at such schools as Calvin College. I went to Calvin College, and my dad went to Calvin College and Seminary, Trinity College and Graduate School, the University of Kentucky. Dr. Jacobs has roughly 30 articles and 3 books to his credit. Let me mention just a little bit about those 3 books. His first book from Indiana University Press was nominated for the American Philosophical Association's Book of the Year. His second book, published by Notre Dame, received the Choice Gold Seal for Outstanding Academic Title. His third book was recently published by Cambridge University Press. And Nathan is also a filmmaker. He did a film that initially attracted me to him, to be real honest with you, and that film was titled Becoming Truly Human. Maybe at the outset, welcome, of course, to our studios, but at the outset, you could talk a little bit about the upshot of that film and its significance in a culture in which more and more people are identifying as nuns, N-O-N-E-S.
Right. Yeah, well, well, first of all, thanks for having me, Hank. And I appreciate, despite your efforts to bring people who are very interesting and dynamic, you've allowed me to come into the studio today. So in terms of becoming truly human, yeah, it focuses on this phenomena of nuns. So sometimes folks will use this term nun, and of course it always has to be spelled out because everyone presumes, wait, Catholic nuns don't believe in God anymore? Is that what's going on? Right, which is not this is not NUN, right? We're not talking about those kind of nuns. The term comes from religion surveys, where when the options are presented, right, are you Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever it is, none of the above is one of the options, right? And that number has grown considerably over the years, originally 5 to 7% in the 90s to, depending on which, research post you're looking at right now, somewhere around 25, 27%, something like that. And so that's caught a lot of folks' attention in terms of asking what's going on with these folks. And that film was a project that was presented to me largely because that's part of my background. My story is that I was a nun, right? I was raised in a Christian home, walked away from the faith, had a lot of questions, pressing questions about what happens when we die. Is there a God? Is God capricious? Do I have free will? These sorts of ultimate and penultimate questions. And having gone to art school, right, at a secular art school, Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, this is where I was at, I was surrounded with lots of folks who were religiously unaffiliated. It was far more common to encounter religiously unaffiliated folks in that context than affiliated folks. So I had a really personal understanding of where the nuns were coming from. And yet, as I talk about in the film, I went through this entire long journey through philosophy, theology. That's really why I was getting the degrees. I didn't go into studying church history or philosophy or any of those things because I was planning on becoming a professor. I was studying them because I wanted answers to hard questions, questions that I thought really mattered. And I share that journey in that film. But one of the things I also do is offer voice to a lot of the nuns. There's really three components to the film. The one is where I offer a humanized portrait of the nuns, one-on-one portraits of folks. I picked a sample of about 7 folks that I thought were a pretty accurate representation of the sort of spectrum you see amongst nuns, because they're not uniform, right? And I allowed an opportunity for them to share their individual stories, where they came from, what sort of upbringing they had when they started asking questions, what sort of questions they had, how they feel right now about the fact that they're unaffiliated. Are they comfortable with that? Do they still have questions? Are there questions that keep them up at night? And so on. Do they consider themselves spiritual? All that sort of stuff. And giving them an opportunity to just speak candidly and clearly about their own journey and who they are, where they're at. And then also to show the spectrum by putting them in conversation with each other. So created this roundtable opportunity to just put out their questions like, well, so when you think of the God of Christianity, what comes to mind, right? And let them share their thoughts on that. And one of the things you inevitably see is that, again, it's the lack of uniformity, that there are certain common trends amongst nuns, but not all nuns agree with each other. Just because 2 people wandered away from the faith, which is, the typical of it. I was Protestant, I was Catholic, I'm no longer that right now. Just because 2 people wander away from religion doesn't mean they wander in the same direction. And so I wanted to give an opportunity to open the discussion about these sorts of topics amongst themselves, right? And begin to speak out loud things that they rarely get to talk about, which was one of the things that came out in a lot of the interviews I had with them, was that they rarely get to talk about religion, because who are they going to talk to about religious topics? And then the third component of the film is, as I said, my story. And the reason I shared my story is because when I look at the nuns, I really don't see them as folks who have reached a destination, right? When I look at the nuns, I see them as folks who are asking hard questions, who have gone through some hard things, who are struggling and have reached a breaking point, with whatever the faith was they were raised in, such that they are now a ship at sea, so to speak, in terms of affiliation. But that doesn't mean they've settled in terms of what they believe. Most of them, have certain inklings about spirituality, but they really don't know what that amounts to. And their sort of religious identity is fluid right now. And in my own case, that fluidity was part of a very long and earnest journey that ultimately led me back to, I shouldn't say, back to Christianity, but specifically to Eastern Orthodoxy, which is where I ultimately ended up at the end of years and years and years of journeying down that road. And I wanted to offer that partially to the nuns, to offer a perspective on themselves, that just because they are, currently unaffiliated doesn't mean they are unaffiliated in perpetuity, as well as offer that perspective to other folks who maybe they have kids who are unaffiliated right now, and they'd say, well, the description of nuns, that's my kid, and I don't understand them. Well, here's an opportunity to hear them speak very honestly about that, as well as a perspective that says, just because, this person you care about is here right now at this stage in their life doesn't mean that's where they're at, in perpetuity. And so really the film is meant to offer a way of, bringing people together to talk about these things and have a clear perspective on this group of folks, and maybe begin a dialogue that, that helps move people forward in a positive direction. It was really meant to be something that is not an end in itself, but something that facilitates dialogue and discussion and begins to move people into conversation in a way that I think is ultimately, supposed to be helpful to them.
So in that introduction to the film and to your own life, your own experience, You mentioned Protestantism, you mentioned Roman Catholicism, and you mentioned that you ended up in Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
I think it might be helpful to everybody listening in to get some kind of a grasp on how the church got to where it is today. We could say with certainty that for the first approximately 1,000 years of church history, there was one church. That one church was governed, as it were, in a collegial fashion by 5 different patriarchates or sees. And then there was a split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. In my book, Truth Matters, Life Matters More, I say the split was caused by fratricide, the sin of fratricide, the unilateral change within the Nicene Creed, the adding of the Filioque and the Son to the Creed.
Right.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back, separated East from West. But then there was also another great schism that took place 500 years later that split the Roman Catholic Church from the Reformers. The Reformers looking at the excesses within medieval Catholicism, and you have this big split. So many people looking at the church now from a Protestant perspective will look back at Roman Catholicism and say Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy are very closely aligned. It's sort of like two faces of the same thing, not a lot of distinction. But as you and I have talked about in private, that's a misunderstanding. In reality, Protestants and Catholics have a whole lot more in common than Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodoxy. Explain that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. My mom is from a long line of Missouri Synod Lutherans. Well, I guess not that long, right? But she's German Lutheran. That's my heritage, and I always take some small pleasure in pointing out to her that her Lutheran background, her Lutheranism, is closer to Roman Catholicism than my Orthodoxy, which, of course, no Lutheran wants to hear that. I mean, there aren't many, worse insults than to say to a Lutheran that.
So you say that with great relish.
Right,
yeah.
right. Having fun, of course, but it's there really is a clear sense in which putting Protestantism and Catholicism in dialogue with each other is much easier than putting Eastern Orthodoxy in dialogue with those traditions. And I think the reason is because in Protestantism and in Catholicism, you have this common Western heritage, right? There has been a certain influence that sits beneath those traditions from Western writers such as Augustine, right? And then even medieval background, even if Thomas Aquinas, for example, is not embraced wholesale, a lot of the medieval, scholasticism sits in the background of what happens in the Reformation. Those writers didn't abandon wholesale everything that they were influenced by. And so the underlying assumptions about, say, the human condition, right, that there was this fall, and this fall has infected us with original sin, and original sin creates this condition under which we're incapable of doing things that are, meritorious before God, and there is this future judgments, and the primary condition of the human person has to do with the impending danger of that future judgment and the demerits we face there, and the question of how do we overcome that. And the role of merits and demerits, now there's dispute, of course, in how that's worked out, right? What the gospel is, whether it's a gospel that promises that by the grace of Christ there can be this fixing of our, affections so that we can do meritorious deeds before God, operating in grace, or whether it's because Christ has done things on our behalf and has taken on our demerits and, produced merits that can be imputed to us. That's part of the dispute, of course, between Roman Catholic and Protestant, but there's still an underlying framework that's common, which makes it possible to have those discussions because they're on the same page. But there are significant differences between East and West more generally, that go sort of farther down into the roots, the foundations of the discussion, where when say a problem is posed like, well, do you believe in salvation by works or faith? Well, that entire way of framing the question presumes that there is a common foundation about merits and demerits and order of affections and original sin and all these sorts of things that are sitting there in the West. And the problem is that question, when you presume those sorts of things up front, you're already sort of too far down the road. You have to go back to more fundamental questions about how we understand, what the fall does, what the human condition really is, about anthropology itself, about what the incarnation accomplishes, what the gospel itself is, in the sense of asking, what did Christ come into the world to do? And ultimately, even salvation, right? What does salvation really look like? What does it amount to? Being saved. Those sorts of more basic questions, in many ways, are the place where, in order to have a real East-West dialogue, you need to start. And I think one of the problems is that in many ways, many Protestants, many Catholics will presume that the underlying framework of the Western discussion is so just granted, so given, that there is no need to do that prior work and sort of dig down to those more foundational questions. But really, that's what you need to do in order to have that sort of conversation. But it is why you're exactly right, that when you look at this, it is, Protestants and Catholics have much more in common right out of the gate in terms of their underlying presumptions than they do with the East. And in this sense, Protestantism is much closer to Catholicism than Eastern Orthodoxy is.
It's been observed, and I wrote about this again in my book, Truth Matters, Life Matters More, that oftentimes Protestants and Orthodox start with a different concept of anthropology. Mm-hmm. I think it was Father Andrew Luth, an Eastern Orthodox father, who describes this in terms of arches. And points out that the Protestant arch, and maybe we could say in a more broad sense, the Western arch has to do with an arch that extends from the fall to redemption in Jesus Christ. That's where the focus is. He then goes on to point out that there's a greater arch, and that arch extends from creation to deification, and that's codified best in a quote by Vladimir Losky, who said, after the fall, the history of the human race is a history of shipwreck awaiting rescue. But the port of salvation, he said, is not the goal. The goal is for the rescued to continue on a journey whose sole goal is union with God. Translated, whose sole goal is deification. So the idea in Eastern Orthodoxy is that God created man good but not perfect, meaning that man could ascend, as it were, up the paradisical mountain to the mountain peak and eat forever from the tree of life, and with unveiled face be translated, sort of to paraphrase the Apostle Paul, from one glory to another, which is a sense in which I taught that long before I became Eastern Orthodox myself, that even in the eternal state, we will never have achieved. We're going to forever learn and grow and develop, explore the glories of God's created handiwork, recreated. The universe now groans and travails, but it's going to be liberated from its body's decay. But we're also going to explore the ineffable God, and there's no coming to an end of that. So there's a sense in which we are being transformed. And this is one of the things that seems to me to be so distinctive about Eastern Orthodoxy in terms of focus. In evangelicalism, and I do think that we can get caught up in a caricature of evangelicalism that's not fair, and I certainly don't want to do that, but so often the faith is reduced to a transactionalism. I prayed a prayer, and now I have a relationship with God, whereas in Eastern Orthodoxy, the focus is not just on being saved. The Eastern Orthodox will say, I am saved, I'm being saved, I will be saved. So it's more of a transformational journey. And that journey never ends, but it's the journey towards deification. So the understanding of how God created Adam and Eve to begin with sets the underpinnings for a proper understanding of Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah, I do think that's right. The underlying anthropology is important, and it's such a rich anthropology. I think I sent to you an article I've got coming out in St. Vladimir's Quarterly soon on whether the soul is immortal, right, in the Eastern Church Fathers, and I walk through a lot of the anthropological assumptions in that article. And one of the things that I think is fascinating is just beginning with the question of how did in an Eastern context, with the Eastern Fathers, would they answer the question, for example, was Adam made mortal or immortal, right? And one of the consistent replies that you see, and this first appears in Philo of Alexandria, but they echo it as well, is that they understand, first of all, before they answer the question, there's this underlying recognition that one of the things that's interesting about our world is that God's creation consists of these invisible, relatively immaterial realities that are in that sense immortal, right? Because they don't dissolve and decay and erode and age. And then you have these other creatures that are organisms, and they erode, they decay. They're inherently mortal in the sense that they can be disassembled, right? They're susceptible to generation and corruption. And one of the things that they see in the Genesis account is that man is this microcosm, where the two halves of creation, the organic world and the sort of immortal celestial world of angels, have been combined. Heaven and earth are brought together, right? Man is brought up from the earth and then breathed in from heaven. And you get this microcosm where everything that God has made has been brought together in man. And that bringing together of this microcosm, right, this human microcosm of the whole of the cosmos, I think is really indicative of how the question about was Adam made mortal or immortal should be answered. And what they really see is that Adam, having sort of these two natures in some ways, right, this more immortal spiritual nature, and then this organic animal nature, that his will sits, at the fulcrum of a balance scale. And by moving toward, his spiritual nature and communing with God, he can become immortal, right? He can partake of the divine nature. He can become immortal and become increasingly God-like by communion with God. Or he can retreat away from that part of his nature into the animal realm and become mortal and subordinate, the higher parts of his nature to the lower. And so in many ways, when looking at Adam and the creation of man in Eden, they don't see it as this pinnacle of idyllic perfection. They see it as a starting point, creating the conditions for moving towards something greater, right? And this also comes through in the way you see the Eastern Fathers read the image-likeness distinction in the Genesis narrative. And so God talks about, let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness, and then he makes man in our own image, and likeness isn't repeated. And they take that to be very intentional, because what they see is that the image, that refers to this part of our nature that is innate and can't be destroyed. We can't wipe out the fact that we're rational, volitional, spiritual, right? Those are realities that are there, whether we want them to be there or not. We can suppress them, we can tarnish them, we can do all sorts of violence and injustice to them, but we can't wipe them out. They're part of our nature. But the likeness has to do with this active moving into maturity and participation in God and becoming more God-like, right? This thing that Adam did not ever become, right? That movement in the balance scale toward that part of the nature that raises man up to something more than he was at his creation. And so really when they look at that, what they see is a picture of the beginning of the making of man, right? Eden is not the completion of the making of man, right? Eden is the beginning of the making of man. And that project, right, that divine project of making man is something that ends up derailed when Adam corrupts our species, right? When he subordinates the higher things to the lower things. And what they see happening then in the incarnation and in the Christian faith generally is the restoration and the raising up of our species to what it was made to be. And that's really what in the Christian faith we're called to enter into. And that is what is ultimately culminated in the resurrection from the dead, where Paul talks about us putting off corruption for incorruption. So really, in many ways, the first time we see a human being fully alive, a human being as man was intended to be, is not in Eden, but it's at the tomb with the resurrected Christ, right? That's the first time you see humanity as humanity was meant to be. That's the first time someone displays the image and the likeness of God. And I think that really then contextualized what is Christianity offering to humanity. It is offering the restoration of our nature for the very purpose of us entering into conformity of Christ to become what we were ultimately made to be in the first place, which culminates in the eschaton.
I want to kind of cut it short right here and use this sort of as an introduction to talking about Eastern Orthodoxy in a series of podcasts that will follow. In my own conversion to Eastern Orthodoxy, so many people have been baffled. For many of them, they just don't understand what Eastern Orthodoxy is. And I've often said, sort of tongue-in-cheek, that most people don't know Eastern Orthodoxy, and they're pretty sure they don't like it. But there's also an attendant problem that within Eastern Orthodoxy, you have people dancing on the ashes of the saints. They're not living in the treasure chest of the saints anymore. They're experiencing sort of a dead orthodoxy. I think it was Yaroslav Pelikan who said that tradition is the living faith of the dead, but traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And many people are caught up in the ism, in the traditionalism, as opposed to tradition rightly understood. So in the series of podcasts that I want to do with you, Nathan, that will follow in the heels of this introduction, I want to talk about some of those things that stumble the evangelical who looks at orthodoxy, doesn't see the distinction between orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism on a broad level, but beyond that, looks at orthodoxy as a religion of dead works, looks at orthodoxy as a religion that rides two horses, rides the horse of Scripture and rides the horse of tradition, and therefore defies the rallying call of the Reformation sola scriptura, or sola fide, or sola Christus. We go through the five solas here, but the idea being that orthodoxy is a system that's dead, it's dull, it's fraught with mysticism, it's fraught with all kinds of illusion. It's a religion that elevates Theotokos or the Virgin Mary to a status that doesn't belong to her. There are so many things within orthodoxy that are troubling to the evangelical mind, and I thought we might want to take each one of those and kind of cash them out on their own. Again, a series of podcasts that I think ultimately will be transformational for those that don't want to simply shoot at one another, but want to learn from one another and want to engage in a conversation that's meaningful as opposed to deflective. So we'll take all of that up and so much more in the next video, the next podcast that I do. We're going to stay right here and we'll continue on for quite a while going over all of that. I'm not sure exactly where the foundational starting point ought to be, but right now in my mind, I'm thinking about icons. So in the next video, I want to talk about icons. The reason I want to do that, Nathan, is I remember when I became Eastern Orthodox, a good friend of mine, a guy that I played golf with for 20, 25 years, cornered one of my sons and said, "What's going on with your dad? He's become an idolater." And my son was, "What are you talking about?" Well, he now goes into the narthex of an Orthodox church and he bows to and worships icons. That's idolatry. That's forbidden in the Scripture. Well, maybe that's the place to start. We'll pick that up in the next podcast.